Okay, so let's go look at this in action. There's two directions that we're going to go in next. The first is manually creating transactions, and we're going to do that first because that's a good way of illustrating how each of the transactions works and how they contribute to the overall ledger for a business location. And then after that, we'll cycle back around and look at the batch processes that makes this easy, every 6 months when you got to do this for a whole bunch of locations. So the home for all of this is under the revenue menu, and it is the first entry here, the weights and measures ledger. And the ledger really operates for the most part on a individual location basis. So the first thing I'm going to do is go open up a Safeway store and take a look at what we've got in the ledger for it. Before I go there, though, there are a couple of transaction types that you don't have to have a registered business location to initiate that transaction. Classic one is a non-commercial invoice. So, the high school gym teacher brings in a scale for their, wrestling meet, and they want you to just test the scale, make sure it's accurate. You're going to charge them, your time and materials for doing the inspection, for doing the test. But that high school and that coach is not going to be registered as a registered business location, for the purposes of your weights and measures program. So non-commercial invoice and payments on non-commercial invoices are what we consider to be ad hoc transactions. So you can do those on the fly, just type in the name of an address of who it is you're doing it for, and you don't have to start by looking up a registered business location. But the ones we're really going to talk about right now are invoices, reinspection invoices, and registration invoices. This is our first topic. And you'll see it's disabled and it says you got to select a location first. You can only do registration invoicing for your registered business locations. So I'll use my magic lookup here. The lookup, this is like a Google lookup. It searches the business name, the business address, the account number, permit numbers if you issue permit numbers for individual device types. It searches cab numbers, cab VIN numbers, cab license plate numbers, all kinds of different things. And then you select one and it will refresh and show you the ledger. I don't have any transactions in here yet. We're going to start with a fresh transaction ledger and go from there. There's a whole bunch of filtering and whatnot here I'm not going to talk about now. I want to get some transactions into the ledger first, and then I'll show you how these different filters and so on work. So let's, without further ado, jump into a registration invoice. So I'm going to create a new registration invoice for this Safeway store. On this screen, there are highlighted fields that are editable, and then there are non-highlighted fields that are populated for you. So the invoice date, I'm not always entering an invoice as I create it. Maybe this invoice I created yesterday and I'm just now entering it in the system. The fiscal year or calendar year, these are either or. If I pick a calendar year, then it's going to blank out my fiscal year. And if I pick a fiscal year, it's going to blank out my calendar year. Okay. Now, remember back to our device type setup, we set up which device types bill on a fiscal year basis and which bill on a calendar year basis. Only the devices whose billing cycle matches my selection here are going to appear on this invoice. Okay, so right now we had, I think we set up our, hop into our device types. We set up most of them as calendar, and then we set up price verification as fiscal. So I'll start out with a calendar year invoice for 2025. And then the last part of the top is the due date, and it's normally going to default to 60 days from the invoice date. If you remember, there was an optional setting for that on the county preferences. So you might set it to 45 days or 30 days or a fixed date, whatever your preferences are there. The next thing we select is who the invoice goes to. And we can configure the system for each individual location as to whether the invoice goes to the location address or to the business owner address. Regardless of what that setting is, that's only going to set our default here. When I'm manually generating an invoice, I can pick to send it to the location, to the business, or to an other address if I need to type one in manually here. Then we also have this option, send via email. I'll come back and talk about that in a bit. We do now have the ability, if we have email addresses for a location, to actually deliver the PDF through an automated email system. So right now I've selected business. So it's going to go to Stone Ridge Mall Road in Pleasanton, California. I can provide an optional invoice description. Whether or not these things appear on the invoice, we'll talk about later, because the invoice template is customizable. It's a simple Word template that you can modify, and you get to pick and choose what appears on your invoices. So normally I would say the invoice description appears on the invoice, but that's only true if you opt to have that included in your invoice template. Okay, now we get to the good stuff. That's all just set up for the invoice general information. Now I want to see devices and price verification stuff with all the calculations, right? Before I do that, I need to pick a fee version. So what does a fee version mean? I didn't really talk about that on our device type fees screen. So back on our device type fees, remember we set up all of these numbers. Well, all of these numbers belong to a specific device type fee version. This is the 2003 fee schedule. Well, we just got authorization from DMS, right, to charge higher fees. And at some point, your county will adopt an ordinance to increase your fees. So how do we up the fees? The way we do that, we don't want to remove the, I don't want to edit these numbers because these were part of setting up a bunch of invoices before. So rather than doing that, we're actually going to create a new version. We'll call it version 2. These are the 2024 fees. They're going to go into effect 1/1/2024. And here, the first thing we're going to change is the registration fee cap's gone to $1,200. Ignore this admin fee cap. There is a provision in the regs to cap admin fees, but it's not used, so it's just a placeholder for potential future functionality. So you should always leave the admin fee cap as blank. So now I've defined 2 fee versions, 2023 and 2024. And when I go back to my grid here, I can switch to our 2024 fees, and they're empty at this point. So I got 2 options. I can start typing all new fee schedule in here, or I can use this button. I can say copy the 2024 fees from 2023, and that'll populate this, and then I can start going through and making changes. So these are going to go to 26 with a location fee of $120. Etc. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but you get the idea. I can create new device registration fees anytime your device fee schedule is changed. And as you can imagine, when I'm generating invoices, I will have options for which fee schedule I'm using. Okay, enough on that for now. So let's go back to our weights and measures revenue screen. And of course, since I changed some data in the system, I have to refresh. And we'll open our Safeway store again and restart our registration invoice. We're going to generate a 2025 invoice, and I'm going to pick the 2024 fees. Okay, so now I've picked fee schedule. Now I've got my fee calculations listed down here. And what the system is showing me is it's showing me all the device types and the device counts that are on the billing cycle that we've selected. So these are all calendar billing cycle things. So you can imagine if I change this from a calendar year invoice to a fiscal year invoice, this area will be blank, and down here you'll see price verification. Then it shows me the current registration fees, location fees, and admin fees from this fee schedule. And it shows me some calculations. So the first calculation it shows me is registration subtotal. Okay, so 13 times $20, $260. Then it shows me location fee and the number of locations that we have, then the location cap group, and then the total location fee applied. So what does all that mean? Well, I didn't update the location fees for all of them. So this one has 100 and this one has 120, 120, one location each, because remember, these aren't truck mounted devices. So unlike truck LPG meters where the number of locations is increased by the number of vehicles, this is just one location each, but they're all in the same cap group. So only the first row that's in cap group A gets a location fee. These other two, the location fee is waived because they're in the same location cap group as this one that's already had a location fee charged. Okay, so these next three columns are just explaining how the location fee is calculated and showing that device types in the same location group, only one of them gets charged a location fee. So then we add up the registration subtotal, location subtotal, and now we're going to look at applying our $1,000 cap. Okay, so we have the cap group, and then we have the registration and location fee capped. And this shows a running total. Now, to explain this, right, we've got two cap groups. We have cap group A and cap group B, and neither one of them adds up to $1,000 yet. So the running total, the location fee capped is this registration plus location cap is the same as each individual one. But I want to show you what it looks like if I have enough counter scales that we actually hit the $1,000 cap. Okay, because this is where it's going to explain to you all this capping and how it works. So let me quit out of here and let me go to our Safeway and go to their counter scales. And I'm going to increase that from 6 devices to 30 devices. That should do it. Now, let's go back here and let's refresh our view. Open up our Safeway ledger again. And let's generate a registration invoice for them. It's going to be a calendar year invoice. And we're going to use the 2024 fees. And you'll see now that in our cap group here, for our computing scales, we're charging $360. And then for our counter scales, we would charge another $936, but we hit this cap, right? Because our running total can't exceed 1,000 for the same cap group. So we're only going to charge $640 for counter scales because then we hit our $1,000 cap. And then admin fee is outside the whole capping calculation, so that's the total admin fee for each of those device types. Okay, so the first set of columns is telling us about location capping. The second set of columns is telling us all about the registration fee capping. And the last set of columns is our admin fee. You'll notice this running total resets, right? So for retail motor fuel meters, we're going to charge $208. Our running total is only $208 because we changed to a different cap group. And this one I'll keep adding for cap group B until we hit $1,000 there, and it will apply the cap again. So every cap group letter gets its own $1,000 cap. Okay, that's all clear as mud. Lots of magic in there, but at least you can see from these columns on this invoice exactly how those calculations are applied. Now, normally when I'm generating a registration invoice, I trust the system to calculate all the right things. There will always be some kind of weird exception. Okay, if there are exceptions, you can click in any of these rows and you can adjust the device count or the number of location fees applied. And you can also remove a device type. So as I said, if you have certain device types at a location where they just have an agreement with you, don't invoice us for those. We're going to bring those in to be inspected, if we use them that year. If they're inadvertently included in this invoice, you can delete them. Okay, so that's the calculation part of the invoice. Then down at the bottom, we have the device amount and the price verification amount, which are always reported separately. In our accounting for device registration, we keep track of the amount that's invoiced for device registration, for admin fees, for location fees, and for price verification and for packers all separately. and it's all separated out when the invoice payments are entered, so that we can generate reports that show you your total revenue, each of those buckets separately. The next thing we see, the next editable part of it, is the adjustment amount. There will be times where you need to adjust an invoice. I don't like adjustments. I would prefer that you adjust the numbers up in this grid, or you go back to the location record and adjust the numbers here, and then regenerate the invoice. And the reason for that is adjustments are hard to account for. So if you make an adjustment here to subtract $100, because they brought cookies in, then their invoice is going to be correct. And when they pay the $1,708, their transaction ledger will be cleared and their current balance will be zero. But I'll have no idea what bucket to apply that minus $100 to. So you're accounting for your total device registration fees, your total admin fees, your total location fees may be off, because I don't know where to subtract that $100 from. Right? So if you're removing a location fee, it's better, instead of applying an invoice adjustment, to simply go up here and just reduce this number of locations. And that'll remove the $100 fee. Okay. Last part is prior balance. As this transaction ledger goes forward, we're going to have invoice, we're going to have debits and credits in there, and a location will have an outstanding balance or an outstanding credit. We always include that in the invoice screen. It's up to you whether you want to include that on the printed invoice. Most counties have a line for prior balance due, and then separate lines for invoice total and total amount due now. But again, that's configurable, and I'll show you how that's set up with the invoice templates. And then last part is remarks. You can enter remarks on the invoice here, whether they relate to an adjustment or they relate to just general information about the location and the invoice itself. These do not, there's no way to print these remarks on the invoice. So they'll always remain county eyes only. Okay, so let's recalculate this. We'll set it to its default, and I will save this invoice. Now, when I save this invoice, there's a transaction ledger, there's an invoices table, all of that information gets populated and saved there, and the system generates the PDF for the invoice. Right, so you don't have to click a print button later. You can immediately download that invoice PDF. So we'll just take a look at what the default one looks like. It's not particularly pretty, but it does have places where we inject the device types, the numbers of devices, the device amount totals, price verification amount totals, late fees, county seal, all of that. And there is this is the generic template. So this is available to any county once they start, and it's already there for you. So if you like it, you can use it. But most counties will work with me to customize this template. And I think, Chris, you asked me to send you some examples of other counties, which I'm not sure I've done yet, but we'll get that worked out for when you do your next round of device printing or invoice printing. Okay, so let me close this screen. I'll come back to it. But you can see in the transaction register now, we have a timestamp, the transaction date, the due date, what kind of transaction it is, what the status is, details of what it is, total amount due, and then the account balance is just the sum of all the transactions that are current in the transaction ledger. Then I can reopen that transaction, look at it, reprint it, do whatever I need. In addition to download invoice PDF, the first few times we go through the printing process, we may find little glitches in your template. So we can regenerate the PDF without actually regenerating the transactions. We're just using the same transaction data to print on a new version of the template. That's pretty useful. And then there's a whole bunch of other operations here. But before I get into the other operations, I want to kind of follow through the normal sequence of events. So under normal circumstances, one of two things happens. Either Safeway pays on time or they don't, right? Let's assume they don't pay on time and we need to send them a late invoice. So how do I do that? Well, I would open the invoice, and at the bottom, you'll see there's a button for second invoice. So I'll click second invoice button, and the system will generate a second invoice. It's kept the same invoice number, but it's changed the revision number from 0 to 1. So this is the first revision of this invoice. The invoice date and the due date follow the settings that I put on the county preferences screen that we talked about. And then down at the bottom, all the fees and everything remain the same, except that we've added a device late fee penalty. And the device late fee penalty has been set at 100% of the device fee amount or the device amount. And again, that was all set up on the county preferences screen, whether that's 100 or 50 or what have you. There is no late penalty fee applied to the admin fee. So right now their total invoice is $40.84.20. You'll note that the prior balance doesn't include that first invoice. So transactionally, let me save this. Oh, and before I talk about transactionally, let's look at the invoice PDF. So there are different templates for the first invoice and the second invoice. The second invoice has a bunch of language in it about being final notice and all the rest of it. So you can customize the language that appears on your first invoice and your second invoice separately. But transactionally, I'm still only going to see one active invoice in their ledger, right? And that's this word current. Is this invoice current? Now up here, I have show canceled revised transactions. That's one of the many buttons I have on my transaction ledger. And let's click that on. And you'll see there's a whole bunch of hidden history in here. Now, I want you to ignore all of this stuff down here. I only want to look at these top 3, because this stuff is just older testing stuff that I was mucking around earlier on. The first transaction we created was this invoice, 39-2024-3. And that's now shown as canceled. And right above that, we have a reversal transaction that takes this 2076.20 and backs it out. And then we have 39-2024-3/1. That's the revision 1 of this invoice that was revised essentially to add the late fees. It's the only current invoice. So all this other stuff is interesting history, but none of it contributes to their current account balance. Okay, and that's how the transaction ledger works. This is really, really important from CDFA's perspective because of the sensitivity of handling the payments and trying to make the system impossible to abuse intentionally. So enough said on that. I'll just say that in the very, very early days, pre-CalCATS in the older system, the Santa Clara County Daily, we got audited by CDFA because there was an employee that was stealing money. And the setup that we have here is what CDFA approved as our solution to prevent that type of activity in the future. So we haven't had a CalCATS audit with CDFA yet, but when we do, I'm confident that it will be just fine. So normally you're not going to see any of that. Just be aware when you issue a second invoice, it basically replaces the first invoice that was issued. And when you're doing reporting and everything, you can associate the two through this invoice number, which doesn't change. The second invoice and any subsequent revisions simply get an increase in the version number. Okay, so we sent them the late notice and they finally pay their bill. How do we register a payment for this invoice? Well, again, there's a batch process for it, but we're going to do this as a 1-by-1. And when that payment comes in, I'm going to go open the ledger for that business location, and I'm going to click on payment receipt. So this is the screen for registering a payment. In CalCATS, you can only apply payments to invoices, right? You can't just enter a random payment without associating it to an invoice that it's a payment on. So the first thing I have to do before I can proceed is pick the invoice that's being paid. Now, what that means is, in some cases, there's going to be some extra work for you because a lot of these big corporate businesses will not send you a check per store. They'll send you one big check for everything. And you'll need to get a list of the invoices that's paying and manually break it out into an individual payment on each invoice. There may come a day in the future where we create some type of multi-invoice payment system, but we don't have it yet, so that's the way things need to be done for now. Once I select the invoice, you'll notice the screen changed because it recognized this is a device registration invoice, and so it's going to want to allocate the payment to device amount, device late fee, PV amount, PV late fee, and admin amount. Splitting it up into device versus PV and late fee versus regular fee is just for internal accounting, right? That's to make reporting more informative for you. But splitting out the admin amount received is critical for your admin fee remission report to CDFA. So if you have a short payment or partial payment, you will need to manually specify how much of that payment is being allocated to admin fee, and then what's left over goes into these other buckets. Okay, most of the time people are great and they pay the full amount, and so you'll notice there's a little comment here that says press the F key in any field to autofill the amounts due. So if I just type F, then it's automatically going to fill in the payment amounts to match what was on the invoice. That's nice and easy. And then I'll register the payment date, which I don't default it to the current date because normally you let payments stack up for a few days before you enter them. But I'll just put this in as 6/24/24. And then if you issued a receipt number, then you can enter a receipt number. If you received it in the mail and you didn't issue a receipt, you can skip that and just enter the payment type and the payment information. What we're asking for payment information varies by the type of payment it is, but just be aware for credit cards, we don't ask for the credit card number or anything. We don't store any of that. We just record a credit card type. And then the payee information, who's paying the bill, is filled in from the invoice, but you can change that if it's a different party that's making the payment, and then you'll save that payment. So now in the transaction ledger, you'll see their current account balance is back to 0. The status on this invoice is still current. It's the invoice for calendar year 2024 for this location, but the status is updated to paid. Okay. Take a quick deep breath. Any questions on that one-by-one registration invoice entry and payment?
John, are you going to go over batch payments?
Yep, most definitely. Once we get done with the other manual transactions, then we'll jump over to the batch processors.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so what other kinds of transactions can we do? Before we move on from registration invoices, let me show you. Let's do the fiscal year invoice for 24/25. And in that one, you'll see there's no devices, but there is PV. And PV, just like devices, if I click in this row, I can change the count, but that's not going to change the registration fee, because if you remember, this is set up with fee per end devices of 0, meaning it's $375 regardless of what this number is. Similarly, I could change the number of locations. That's not going to change anything on the invoice because we don't charge location fees for PV. So PV invoicing is super simple. You just got to make sure you got the category right. If these guys are not, PV 10 plus, then you need to go change that on their location record and then come back in and start the invoice over. Okay, so let's save that. And now let's take a very common example and say, right, they've got this invoice for $375. They send you a check for $374. Now you got two options here. It's a short paid by $1, and you can opt to reject that check, send it back to them, and tell them to send you a check for the correct amount. But a lot of counties don't do that. In a lot of cases, we're talking about 20 cents or 10 cents on an invoice, and it's going to cost more money to send the check back and ask for another one than it would just to accept the short payment. So how would I accept a short payment on an invoice with the intention that I want to clear this invoice and call it paid? right? The thing I don't want to do is I don't want to just put in a payment of $374. Right? Well, it wouldn't go there anyway. It would go in PV amount received. Because if I do that, then it's not going to register that invoice as paid. So what do I do? And I'm just going to point out this link up here, Revenue Help and FAQ. There are certain areas in the system where even the online help is too far away. And I wanted to give you hints and suggestions directly on the screen that you're working on. So here's the answer to how I do this, which in short says, if I decide I'm going to accept $374 for this invoice, what I'm going to do is adjust the invoice. So down at the bottom here, we got all these other things that we can do. I'm going to use this revise button. And the reason for the reversal is I'm accepting a $1 short pay. And then I'm going to add an adjustment amount of minus $1. Typing is not my skill today. So now you'll see the new revised total due is going to be $374. Okay. Now I don't necessarily have to reprint this invoice because they've already sent the invoice, the payment in. But let's say a customer calls and complains about something and you want to revise their invoice. You could then download the PDF of this, which has, the adjustment amount, the adjustment description, minus $1, accepting short pay. Right. So it all depends on what the circumstances are. But now when I accept a payment for that invoice, I can just use the F button to put in my total amount. So what's going to happen from an accounting perspective, we're going to count $375 of PV revenue and minus $1 of adjustment revenue. Okay? And that's going to clear that invoice as paid. Okay, so there are a few other, weird odds and ends that happen, and this screen can be very helpful on my suggested ways of dealing with that. Ultimately, the most direct adjustment you can make is the best. So if you can adjust the device count or the location fee count, do that. If you can't do that, then at least adjust the invoice itself. And if you still can't do that, there is this bailout transaction called an account adjustment. There is a special permission you have to use account adjustments, but that account adjustment just enters a single adjusting transaction in the ledger. So it's not going to count any invoices as paid. It's just going to adjust the current account balance. Okay. Next, let's take a look at other invoice types. So reinspection, when your weights and measures inspectors go out to place a device in service, they show up and we assume that the service agent has correctly repaired the device. But if that's not true and the device is still out of spec, then at some point your weights and measures inspectors can invoice that location for another reinspection. And different counties have different policies to whether that's the second failure or the third failure. But you can then issue an invoice for that failed inspection. Now, first, before I can issue a reinspection invoice, I need to have a failed inspection that's flagged for invoicing, right? And helpfully, the screen dims that button out because right now there are no failed inspections at this Safeway store. So while we're here, I'm going to go do a quick failed inspection on that Safeway store. And I'll do it on their counter scales. So today we had a routine inspection. And we have 36 devices. So 35 of them passed and one failed over. I'm not going to cover the details of what I'm doing here. Just trust me, I'm just doing an inspection for a failed device. Change that to a different day. So now I've had a device failure at that Safeway on their counter scales. Now I'm going to send out my inspector to do the reinspection. They perform the reinspection and they discover that this is from the 22nd. They discover that that device fails again. And they decide that they're going to charge for this inspection. So I go back to our Safeway register. And now I'll see that the reinspection invoice button is enabled. What that means is there's a place and service call inspection that was done by an inspector that was flagged to be invoiced. Now, don't worry, you don't have to go searching through all of your locations every day to see who needs a reinspection invoice. There's a report that tells you all of the reinspection eligible inspections or invoice eligible inspections that have not been invoiced yet. When I generate a reinspection invoice, we need to select the fee version. We also need to select the inspection that was done. Because unlike device registration, re-inspections, at least in CalCATS right now, are invoiced based on hours and mileage. And the hours and mileage are pulled off of the inspection report. And I didn't enter any hours or miles on my quickie inspection report, so the totals are going to be 0. But whatever the inspector put in on the inspection for hours and mileage will be reflected on the invoice. And the labor rate and mileage rate, if you recall, were the first 2 columns on our device type fee configuration screen. So you can set different labor rates and mileage rates for each device type if you have, that kind of setup. Okay. I don't want to go any more there. There is a separate template, just like there was a template for the first and second device registration invoices. There's a template for non-commercial invoices, for reinspection invoices. The next type we'll look at is miscellaneous invoices. And this is more of like a QuickBooks type of invoice where you're going to say add item. So I'm going to add a taxi missed appointment, count 1, unit cost $65. And then I'm going to add an invoice item for other services, count 1, unit cost $100. Okay, so you build an invoice just basically adding invoice items, line items, total count, and extended cost. These invoices behave like other invoices. There's yet another template that you can build for your miscellaneous invoice printout, and you can accept payments on them. Obviously, these numbers don't play into your device registration accounting reports, but it does let you keep track of things that are due. And eventually, if you tie into our payment portal, you can put in things like NOPAs, fines, and things like that in here as miscellaneous invoices, which allow people to pay those online. The list of invoice items that we saw there was that one configuration I skipped over. So if you recall, I said I would come back to this invoice item types. We have kind of a generic list that you'll start out with, but you can manage this list. So you can put any line items that you want to be able to charge in your miscellaneous invoices into this list, and then they'll be available on that miscellaneous invoice form.
I have a quick question regarding the re-inspection invoice. Yep. So for like our price verification, we just have like a flat fee. So we don't bill by hours. We just are like, if you have 1 to 3, it's 50. So could that be reconfigured to be like flat fees?
So 2-part answer. The first part is there are a lot of counties that the re-inspection invoice, whether it's devices or PV, if it's a re-inspection, they charge a flat fee. So yes, I'm working on an enhancement to CalCATS that will to CalCATS that will let you specify a flat fee by device type for re-inspection invoices rather than a labor rate and a mileage rate. Meanwhile, if it's just for price verification, it would not be unreasonable to use an invoice line item and a miscellaneous invoice to charge for a price verification reinspection. And the reason I say that is the only reason I discourage using miscellaneous invoices for anything to do with device registration or inspections is that you lose some of the accounting detail if you run reports on those programs. But since price verification doesn't play into any of those kinds of reports, it's not not device price verification. Re-inspections don't play into the device registration accounting reports. It doesn't really matter if that fee, that re-inspection fee, is not going to appear under price verification or devices in your device registration reports. So temporary workaround, but ultimately, yes, you'll have a direct configuration that lets you specify a flat fee for re-inspections.
Okay, but for right now, we would just click that first button, the regular invoice. Okay, got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
So the last one I want to cover here is the non-commercial invoice. You can issue a non-commercial invoice to a registered business location. So you might have a farmer's market that has registered hanging scales and computing scales and things like that you generally invoice for in the normal manner. But they show up and they say they want they're raffling off whoever guesses the weight of the giant watermelon. And so they want you to test a scale for measuring the watermelon, but it's not going to be used for commercial purposes. So you'll charge them as a non-commercial inspection. But as I said, it's more common for that to be done on someone or for someone that is not a registered business location. So I'm going to clear out this Safeway location and show you what it's like to issue a non-commercial invoice under normal circumstances. So here, the fiscal year and calendar year really don't make any difference. I'll go down to here. We don't have the option for clicking location or business, so we have to fill out the information about who the invoice is going to. And then once I pick a fee version, instead of having a preset list of device types, you're just going to select the device type that you're being asked to test. So if they were doing a counter scale, and then again, you would charge the hours. The labor rate is not predefined. And again, a lot of counties have different rates depending on what kind of organization it is, if it's a school or a charitable organization or, a city government office or something like that. And then mileage is generally not applicable because for most of these, they're brought into the office. So you can just add devices and the total amount that you're charging for them and issue that invoice. Again, there's another template set up for non-commercial inspections. But those go into a bucket. Let me put in some information here. So this would be some high school. And it's so now I've issued this invoice. I can look at the invoice PDF. There's as I said, a separate kind of template for that. And when I close this, now how do I see that? How do I go find that invoice so I can do a payment on it? So now let's talk about some of these other filters and checkboxes and things here. There is a checkbox specifically for what we call non-business transactions. That's non-commercial inspections. So if I check that, then it's going to show me all of these transactions that belong to entities other than registered business locations. Okay, so that's where you'll go to see all of your non-commercial invoices. And if I want to register the payment, all I got to do is go find that invoice, right, which is be by invoice number 9FY. So it's this high school one. Now, you notice when I do this, like if I'm at a registered location and I click payment receipt, all of their invoices are pre-populated here. But at some point you may have a lot of non-commercial invoices outstanding. And so it's not a good idea to create a drop-down list of hundreds and hundreds of items. So this is just a type ahead search. So as I type, it's going to narrow down my list. And again, that doesn't have to be the beginning. I can just type in, this is for high school. And well, it should have found that. Okay, otherwise entering the payment is pretty much the same as entering a payment for any registered business location. We already talked about the show canceled revised transactions, show items in collections. If I send an invoice to collections, it generally comes out of the transaction ledger. But if you want to see them temporarily, you can just turn on show items in collections and it will display those in the ledger for that location. And then the last one is show multiple locations. So I may want to do a search for invoices. So if I turn on show multiple locations, this is going to show me every transaction in the system. And then I can start using these filters down here. So I want to see all payments and I want to see them within a date range. Or I want to see all invoices, but only all miscellaneous invoices. Okay, so I can start using these filters to search all of my transactions, even across multiple locations. But to do that, I got to turn on this show multiple locations box. And then once I've narrowed it down to, whatever it is I'm looking at, so let's look at all device registration invoices, and then I can hit export transactions. So this is a little transaction export. And while I'm here, let's talk about, you're going to see a lot of Excel spreadsheets like this once we get into the reporting module, which will be in not too many minutes from now. Whenever you get an export from CalCATS, because it's a web application, you always get this banner that says, you're in protected view. Our spreadsheets that we export have formulas in them. So they're live spreadsheets that will recalculate if you adjust anything. So you'll need to click on that enable editing. If you don't, you're going to see a lot of those Excel NA error messages because the formulas aren't recalculating. Secondly, every export that we do always has this cover sheet. It's called export info, and it tells you what it is you exported, who exported it, and what the filter criteria were for this export. So if you're like me and you have this giant collection of hundreds and hundreds of exported Excel files, and you can't remember what's in them, don't worry, the file itself has the details of what's in it described on that first page. And then the second tab and subsequent tabs are the data that you asked for. So here we'll see we've got details on the transactions, and there's more here than you would necessarily see on the transaction ledger itself. So in the export, we include the transaction amounts and split up the amounts into the different pieces, whether it's a reversal, and then all the details about associated payments and so on. So, hopefully this is a useful beginning to our discussion on reporting and how you get all of this data out of CalCATS for your financial analysis. Okay, that's everything I wanted to cover on the transaction ledger. This is the one-by-one transaction entry system. The next component to talk about is the batch entry system.